When we talk about social development in adolescence, really we're focused on things like identity formation, right? So if you remember Eric Erickson, he said that there was an identity crisis. There's also intimacy. We talked about intimacy as a close emotional bond with a romantic partner or non-family member. It could even you can have intimate relationships with friends as well, but typically it's when we use intimacy, it's a close emotional bond with a romantic partner. And then ultimately, we said adolescence, the end of adolescence is the separation from one's parents, um, assuming adult like responsibilities. And the process of separating from one's parents is a gradual process, right? So there's the emotional and cognitive separation, and then ultimately a physical separation. So let's talk identity. What is identity? Identity is our sense of self, right? So uh, it's how we figure out who we are. And what we believe is that uh, teenagers oftentimes will try different selves or different versions of who they are in different situations. And by the end of this exploration, they will have some kind of composite identity. Now, some people are going to foreclose, which means that they're going to just fuse to a particular identity and prematurely without exploration. But some people after exploration will land where they want to land. Now, what we tend to see is that in adolescence, some people are going to take on a position that's uh, their parents' point of view. Others are going to be in opposition of their parents' point of view. And then uh, typically, people will figure out who they are. But there are some people, I said when we talked about Eric Erickson, um, that there is this identity confusion, right? So there are some people who don't figure out who they are and they wind up flip flopping through life when trying to figure out who they are, and they're not consistent or stable in their sense of self. Intimacy, right? So intimacy is the ability to form close, loving relationships. This is outside of a caregiver situation, right? So Carol Gilligan also talks about the struggle for personal identity is harder for males to figure out who they are than females in general, but females are oftentimes are more interdependent, whereas males are more independent. Now, what's interesting outside of romantic relationships, so with friendships, both males and females report more intimate friendships, closer friendships with other females, right? So that closeness um, oftentimes is reported. Yeah, my best friend is oftentimes female. And then in terms of our society, society will shape how we establish our relationships, and the expectations that are put on us will also shape who we are. Now, we also want to eventually separate from our parents. We want to become distinct from our parents. So that starts, as I said, on a psychological and social point of view, right? So you're starting to see yourself distinct from your parents, see yourself distinct from their points of view. You're starting to identify their hypocrisy. So you're going to argue. Now, if you were to look at the average teenager and their parents, there is conflict. It's not uncommon to have arguments over mundane or silly things. But in the long term, that's okay. In the long term, psychologically, these arguments are usually not destructive, right? When a person leaves adolescence and establishes their independence, a lot of those arguments dissipate. And the voice of one's parents, which is interesting, is diminished and the power of one's peer group is increased. So when you're a child, your primary influence is your parents, but by the time you become a teenager, you're more influenced by your peers and you start to devalue what your parents have to say. So these are processes of separating, right, from one's parents. Now, post puberty, we also have to talk about relationships. So, if we were to look at sexual maturation, how long is it that people are staying home, living at home before assuming those adult like responsibilities? What's interesting is from puberty to independence in 1890 was roughly 7 years, right? And now, or as of 1995, it's doubled. People are staying home longer. And I would argue, although I don't have the data in front of me, it's probably even longer today, right? Because we see a phenomenon happening where people are doing an attempt at leaving and then they return home because, quote unquote, they say adulting is too hard, right? So they go back home, and then when they're ready, they leave again. So we see a huge difference between even a century ago till now. So people are staying home longer, and it makes sense, right? Because there are several factors at play. Um, the emphasis on marriage and starting a family was greater in 1890. Relationships focused more on legacy than um, love. And yeah, the people weren't living as long as today, so there was an urgency. And then in terms of school, going to school before you start in the workforce, people weren't spending as much time in college. So a lot of things have changed, which is extending the distance from puberty to adulthood. So um, that's pretty much where I want to stop today, and we'll pick up with other changes next class, and then we'll do social psychology.